Alright, what's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. I'm Tokenicer, and I'm here to bring you guys in-depth news, analysis, and insights from the digital asset space, along with covering the progressive tokenization of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to check out Tokenicer.network for all my content platforms in one convenient spot. From my Twitter threads, Medium articles, Spotify podcasts, and much more. You can find all that there, and of course that'll be linked right down in the description below. So in today's episode, I'm bringing you guys once again another Tea Time exclusive from my show on Chain Stats. And yes, for those of you guys who might be confused, we have rebranded from Terramoon into Chain Stats, where we're now much more focused on truly unleashing all that we can research and analyze with on-chain statistics. I'll be sure to keep you guys updated with all the exciting news and development we have moving forward. But in this episode of Tea Time, we actually did things a little differently than we normally would, as for a way to celebrate our Discord channels temporarily being opened up during the whole FTX craze. So rather than just looking at one or two projects and deep diving into them like we normally would, we actually took a look into 7 different utility networks that I personally believed were some of the most innovative and unique with what they're building, so that everyone could kind of learn more about the projects we regularly discuss in here, and potentially even open some of their eyes to tokens that they might want to accumulate during these times of craze in the market. And while we are transitioning to Chain Stats, our Discord is still more active than ever with daily market updates of on-chain statistics like exchange inflows and outflows, along with multiple channels for fundamental and technical focused discussion groups. So do be sure to join our community and get more knowledge out of there if you haven't already. And of course, that'll also be right down in the description below. Now, just before we start, I just got to remind everyone real quick that I'm not a financial advisor, and therefore nothing you ever hear or read from me should ever be taken as any form of financial or investment advice. But now that we got that out of the way, let's get right into it. Alright, good morning everyone. So today for tea time, we're going to be doing things a little differently. So usually we deep dive into 1 or 2 projects at a time, right? So today we're kind of doing more of a overview of multiple projects we've previously looked at. And so this is nothing new really. We've talked about pretty much every single one of these projects besides Energy Web, which we'll do a little bit of an early rundown on. But for the most part, I've shown you guys everything that's in here, and this is more of just a review and kind of to look at the fundamentals of these projects as we kind of get closer towards that capitulation level, so you guys can kind of see what you want to accumulate once we reach those prices, and see which utility tokens you guys are kind of fond of. So here we have 7 projects that I personally find to be some of the best in this space, and that's LCX, which is building a regulated exchange out in Liechtenstein with a lot of connections to things like the World Economic Forum. We got AZERO, which is one of the more prominent layer 1s being built, and they're built of a team of some of probably the smartest people in the blockchain space. We got AllianceBlock. This is a project that's building for regulated DeFi, or what they would call CDeFi. So it's bridging everything centralized finance with decentralized finance. And they kind of do so by having multiple layers of compliance and cross-border compliance, which we'll get into briefly every one of these projects very shortly, but I just want to do a quick rundown on what these projects basically do. Morpheus Network is a agnostic middleware technology that sits over all the supply chain modules. So you can connect legacy supply chain modules that, say, big companies like DHL or UPS may use to things kind of building in the blockchain space that are also building in that industry. So other chains like Origin Trail or VeChain. Quant, I don't think I need to explain too much about this. They are building an operating system that's completely agnostic to any technology. So you can connect blockchains to, say, blockchains, for example, or you could connect a legacy system to blockchains. So say a real-time gross settlement system. You could connect that to a DLT network. And there have been hints of this already being done, which again we'll get into very shortly. Got Constellation Network. I'm sure everyone's familiar with Constellation here. They're basically building a layer 0 network that's kind of sitting underneath all of this blockchain layer, and they've already built out a variety of different applications which are all kind of focused on the concept of data. And then we've got Energy Web Token, which is another layer 1 network actually, but their focus is actually on having an enterprise grade system ready to host all the applications that we're kind of moving to as we switch over to this new narrative of ESG standards. We'll start here with LCX. So we kind of know what LCX does, being a regulated exchange, right? Now, I did want to put out there that, ironically, while they are operating legitimately in every part of the world, really, the SEC has still come out and labeled them as a security. Now, there hasn't been much progression on kind of that case, but there are, if you guys go into the actual document of kind of why they think LCX is a security, they do state that one of the reasons why is because their CEO, Monty Metzger, during his time at Davos this year, so Davos is an annual World Economic Forum held event, and he basically was promoting a sign that said "Goodbye Goldman," and it basically was an advertisement for LCX. Now, we know Gary Gensler did spend 26 years at Goldman, so maybe that rubbed him the wrong way. But anyways, let's look into some of the more positives, or I guess things that'll actually matter, because I'm not too sure a lawsuit like that, or it's not even a lawsuit, but a case like that would matter too much at the moment. So one thing that really stands out to me with LCX is their advisory board. They've got some of the biggest names for an advisory board out of any crypto team, in my opinion. So we see these connections here, and as we can see, these are all massive organizations they're connected to. The European Organization, Animoca Brands, the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, Bloomberg, Apple, Celsius. I guess I should probably take Celsius off of there after what's happened, but there's also OpenSea, Wikipedia, the Blockchain Research Institute, the World Health Organization, and BlackRock. And so a lot of these positions that these guys hold are kind of advisory to a bunch of these organizations. And if not that, just having worked with them either directly or indirectly in the past through their own personal startups or kind of just their own think tanks. So for example, Don Tapscott being in the Blockchain Research Institute, he's actually the founder of this organization, and we've talked about this consortium a lot. There's a lot of different kind of big tech companies in there, but also finance companies, and then kind of some policymakers. Like we see Bankers Law of Liechtenstein in the Blockchain Research Institute, in addition to the Bank of Canada. And then the World Economic Forum, we can see most of these members actually do have some form of connection there. Again, another example of this with Don Tapscott. He's actually the senior advisor for the World Economic Forum. And that's really saying a lot, because that's not a position you just easily land, right? So having him on the advisory board for the World Economic Forum, in addition to LCX, I think that's a pretty good sign. Now, another part of their operations is security tokens. So there's three classifications of tokens. There's utility tokens. These are the ones we mainly talk about, right? These are ones that kind of are used for a specific protocol or network, and they're actually essential for it. So without the token, the network doesn't function. There's also payment tokens or transactional ones. These would be similar to ones like you could say stable coins, or ones that transact very quickly and settle really quickly, because those are probably the ones you want for payments, especially in a market like this where prices are fluctuating at very volatile prices, right? There's also security tokens, and so security tokens are ones we haven't quite seen too much yet, and I'm sure you guys can kind of tell by the name, but security tokens are pretty much a security, so like a stock or well, equity in a company, or maybe a mutual fund or an ETF, it pretty much gets tokenized onto a blockchain, and voila, you have a security token. So this creates for a lot of different opportunities for things like fractional ownership, but also tracking and tracing of a specific asset. Because one issue with regular securities nowadays, I'll take stocks for an example, is that a lot of times the ownership is 16 to 1. This means 16 different people can own one stock. So if all 16 people decide to sell that stock, you have to think to yourself, who actually gets that money? So security tokens do bring a lot of innovation to the financial industry, and this is something that LCX is working to bring. They do have a token management sale platform along with tokenizing securities for other institutions. And I'm sure as we see more mainstream regulations take place, well, I don't want to say mainstream regulation, but industry regulation take place, and more adoption come into just tokenizing your assets on a blockchain, because I'm sure that will come, as it makes sense for every industry to really tokenize it. Well, not every industry, but I guess we're talking about the financial industry here. It makes sense for just about everything on the financial industry to get tokenized, because currently one of the biggest problems in finance is just it's too slow and inefficient. And if you move everything onto a blockchain, it really flows the way it should be at internet scale, rather than kind of our current system of, well, it's just a debit and credit system of points, really. That's all it is, right? When you're operating as a regulated exchange, the way to do so is to have the license provided to be considered regulated, right? Now, fortunately, in Liechtenstein, they've already laid out a pretty clear rule of how they want blockchain regulations. And so they have multiple licenses that you can acquire if you want to operate as a business there. So these are the ones LCX has acquired. So they all have TT in front of them. This just stands for Trusted Technology. But we can see they are an exchange service provider. And all these titles are fairly self-explanatory, but to briefly go into them, an exchange service provider, you can pretty much provide exchange services. So things like swapping crypto to, or swapping fiat to crypto, or crypto to crypto, or fiat to crypto. Pretty much anything that any other exchange does. Only LCX has a legitimate license for it. Token depository. So they are legally allowed and capable of having tokens deposited into their exchange and allowing users to operate on the exchange with their tokens. A key depository. So this is more for their LCX Vault, their custody service, right? And this is pretty much for them to safeguard and hold other people's keys. A price service provider. So this is actually a collaboration they've had with Chainlink, where they use Chainlink as one of their price oracles, in addition to other ways to aggregate price feeds. And through doing so, they have a plethora of different price feeds they're getting from different service providers. They're actually able to provide prices. Currently, I believe it's only for Bitcoin and Ethereum that they're doing it for. But they can do so for institutions, which is actually pretty massive, because when you're an institution, you kind of want to get the most, I guess, true to market price, right? And then TT identity service provider. So LCX being an exchange that will obviously require KYC, because as crypto moves forwards and regulations continue, just about everything's going to be KYC, whether we like it or not. So they do have an identity service provider on that end for that. But in addition to that, as we were talking about with security tokens, currently how it is to buy a stock, you need to be completely registered. Like, they need to know your bank account, your name, your address, everything like that. With security tokens, it's probably going to be very similar. So they'll have a table of all the people holding a specific security token at a said time. So of course they'll need an identity service provider for that. They're also a token generator. This allows them to do things like generate security tokens and generate and manage tokens on behalf of other parties that want to have their assets tokenized or just have their tokens managed through LCX. And these two other licenses, of course, also play into that. Well, it's one license, but token issuer on its own and token issuer on behalf of other clients. So these are some of their general partners. So we've talked about with Chainlink for price feeds. We've talked about with Constellation. So this is really the quick rundown of what this partnership will be. So LCX will be supporting the listing of tokens created using the Constellation Network Layer 0 token standard. LCX and Constellation will collaborate to use Constellation's hypergraph to bring trade and transaction transparency to the centralized exchange. So this is the part I'm personally most excited for within this partnership. There's also LCX will integrate native wallets to support DAG and list DAG at LCX Exchange. LCX will list the Lattice Exchange at LCX. And this was another one I'm interested in because I think we could potentially see some further collaborations between LCX and Lattice. Maybe it's something to do with the fiat backbones on LTX's end. Maybe they could utilize LCX in some way with that. We'll have to see kind of how that goes and legally how that really works. And speaking of legal, LCX will also be providing legal assistance and a legal framework package for additional AZERO tokens and businesses. So this is another part where it just makes sense, right? Because LCX having 8 licenses, they're probably pretty familiar with the law at this point. And so getting them to kind of just help and provide some advisory to kind of how to go about legally for creating tokens will definitely help with, not running into the law later on. Then they've also collaborated with Quant. So there's been a little bit of update on this, and it's pretty much saying that, well, I guess a lot of this we already know, but LCX will not only list Quant on their exchange, which they've already done, but they'll be running a gateway through their exchange. So for anyone unfamiliar, a gateway is similar to a node in Quant's ecosystem. So instead of, say, running a node like you would with any other network and getting paid at something like 10% APY, running a gateway is pretty different because you can actually run a gateway without any QNT tokens on there. But if you do stake your tokens, you actually provide more throughput to your specific gateway. And so these gateways rewards are transactional based. For every transaction on Overledger, so Quant's network, a fraction of QNT is taken off of each transaction, and that's kind of the fee. So the fee is allocated to these different gateways, and so the more transactions that flow through the Overledger network, the more fees you're actually bound to make. They've also collaborated with Zilliqa, Polkadot, and Hedera Hashgraph. These two, with Zilliqa and Polkadot, this is just more focused on kind of having the security token standard also on their protocol. So I'm not sure if I actually have... Oh, there it is. All right. So this is the Liechtenstein protocol, and this is kind of what they've built to be the standard for security tokens. And so this is a blockchain agnostic standard that can be integrated into any other blockchain. And it pretty much ensures a couple things. So it ensures that every security token will have a KYC registry. And so between every trade, so let's say I want to send a security token to one of you guys or something, it has to automate either through a smart contract or something that there's an identity check of both me and you to ensure that you're actually able to hold that underlying security token and it's legal under your respective jurisdictions. And then once the identity registry checks that and checks the compliance of both parties, they update the cap table. So the cap table just shows in real time who owns what, really, right? Because we've had a lot of financial blow-ups because of the whole nobody knows who owns what, right? So once that happens, then the smart contract for the security token finally executes between person A and person B. And so this is a standard. While it is called the Liechtenstein standard, that is just a name. They do plan to globally integrate this standard in the future to really have security tokens work efficiently in mass. Now, with Hedera Hashgraph, this partnership is a little different. So They have integrated the Liechtenstein protocol into the Hedera network in addition to their security token standard. But how they really plan to utilize this, besides listing HBAR on LCX, which they do with just about every single one of their partnerships, I guess it makes sense. But with Hedera, they actually plan to integrate the Liechtenstein protocol into Hedera's token services. So if anyone's not aware of Hedera's token services, essentially what it is much like many other Layer 1 platforms, you can mint your own token. Except once they've integrated the Liechtenstein protocol, they can actually, probably not Hedera themselves, but any institution that comes in and wants to mint security tokens, they can already do so in a very compliant manner following the Liechtenstein protocol, as it's already been integrated. So that's kind of our rundown of LCX. So LF0 is a permissionless DAG, so a directed acyclic graph. I'm sure most of us have heard of that by now. So think of this as a blockchain where everything's very linear, right? It's like once this block's been verified, it's the next block's turn, and so on and so forth. And you're always looking at the transactional data within the last block. Now, with a directed acyclic graph, it's a lot more random, to where when data comes into the network, it gets verified. And it's not really time-based, but it's more, I want to say volume-based, to when more transactions come in, the more these nodes really have to work, really, right? And so this is just what I've personally seen, but I've seen for real business use cases and for really large scale use cases, most of these enterprises and institutions have sided with directed acyclic graphs to build their operations upon. So we've seen things like CCANT, which is in Europe, working with IOTA on their healthcare systems. We've seen the Department of Defense working with Constellation Network for JADC2, and we've seen actually an aerospace system that also got an SBIR grant under Hedera's name. So we're seeing a lot of kind of real operations developing on directed acyclic graphs. So LF0 is a really privacy-focused Layer 1 network, and they run on a consensus called LF Byzantine fault tolerance. Byzantine fault tolerance, for anyone who's not aware, this is kind of a little graph of it. And pretty much what this is showing is that, so we see one big empire here, right? So think of this as a very large empire, and everyone else here is a different party that's all in agreement to try and take down this empire. And so because it's such a large empire, you need a full coordination. If even 2 or 3 people step out, well, the plan fails. The issue with this is that what if, let's say, one of these people are actually someone within the empire, and they're aware that if a couple people do kind of flake out of this plan, it fails, and the empire just gets that much, well, I don't want to say gets that much stronger, but the empire ends up winning. So the issue around this is not being sure whether you can actually trust if someone is legitimately going to carry through with their plan, right? Well, that's kind of where asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerance comes in, and ensures that even when there's a couple bad actors within the network, as long as the majority of the network still reaches consensus, pretty much you don't have to worry about the bad actors, is one way to put it, I guess. They're kind of built in a way that we really haven't seen from other Layer 1 networks. So they have something they call liminal. So liminal is this kind of Layer 2 system that they've built, and it's what they use for private DeFi. There's a lot of things within the liminal system, but the main thing you guys have to really know is just it supports privacy and smart contracts, and this is interoperable to other networks. So you can, let's say, apply a smart contract on Solana that's built on LF0, and you can keep all the state data on LF0. So that's probably something that's quite attractive to developers. And just a little more on liminal. This does use both parts of ZK snarks and multi-party computation. So multi-party computation you guys may have heard of this in addition to ZK proofs. So they work fairly similar, and while there are some differences between the two, when put together, they actually complement each other. And we haven't actually seen much of layer 1 networks really combining the two together. So to kind of just explain it, these two pretty much explain zero knowledge proofs. And essentially what this is saying is that, let's say there's person B, and actually let's say this is Bob and that's Alice. So Alice wants to prove to Bob that she knows the code to the store that's inside a cave, right? Now, to get inside the cave, there's two paths. There's path A and path B. So if Bob says, if Bob sees Alice enter through path A, and she sees her come out through path B, well, there has to be some way to open this door, right? And to open the door, you have to have the code. So basically what this is saying is that Alice wants to prove to Bob that she knows the password, but she doesn't want to actually say the password in the case that Bob might not know it, and she might not want to share the password to someone that doesn't know. So this is a way of, a simple way of saying this is a way of proving to computers that one computer has the information of a specific recipient without revealing the full information of that. SMPC actually works in a very similar way, except this is a more kind of large scale kind of operation. So SMPC stands for Smart Multi-Party Computation. And so this is very similar to ZKs, only that it can be done in, well, a party with multiple computers, right? Whereas ZKs, as we can see here, both these instances are both just with between two people. So when you combine them together, you get a lot more efficiency, because the problem with MPC is just that it's very slow. So when you combine ZKs, which are being used in the Ethereum network a lot because of their issues with scaling, right? Which means they, while not incredibly fast, definitely more efficient than MPC is. So when you combine the two, you kind of make up for each other's weaknesses. One thing we talked a lot with ALZERO is kind of with their team. So their CEO is Matthew Nyberg, and one thing about their team is, rather than having tons and tons of kind of industry and entrepreneurship experience on their team, they're actually a lot more academic focused. And so when we look at their team up here, a lot of these members, they have the title PhD to them. So we can see this is fairly academic based. And so these, a lot of these guys are from Cornell University, and they have done multiple publications on kind of things that do relate to the operations of ALZERO. So if we look here, for example, this is Adam Gagel. I believe he he's the co-founder of ALZERO, and in a lot of these are publications and certain case studies. These are all very similar to the operations that ALZERO does, right? So this one's actually called LF, Efficient Atomic Broadcast in Asynchronous Networks with Byzantine Nodes. So this is probably part of how they built out their consensus mechanism of LF Byzantine fault tolerance, right? And then LF, a leaderless asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerant consensus protocol. So more of that. Graph sharing game, this may or may not have something to do with it. Efficient consensus with flexible finality. And so we've heard of the talks of consensus and finality a lot within these kind of blockchain networks, especially when we're talking about finality of, payments reaching finality, right? So we can see there's a lot of relevant experience, while not in the world of kind of actually working and in the enterprise world. These guys definitely know kind of what they're talking about. Now, while they are very academic focused, a couple hints of pretty interesting connections are here, for example. So they have one advisor named Jory, and he actually spent some time at Prism Group. So Prism Group is a kind of research and development center, and it has a lot of focuses on things like consortium governance, consensus governance, tokenomics, incentive designs, market structure. And so we can tell they're kind of a crypto-based company, right? Well, it's kind of a consulting firm almost. And so Jory was their senior advisor. And we can see here that they've actually had some very interesting partners they've worked with. So they've presented their research to DARPA. These are the guys who pretty much founded the internet. The Federal Reserve, IBM, Microsoft, Pantera Capital, Polychain Capital, A16Z, Union Square Ventures, Hashed, Harvard, MIT. I'm not sure what Enver is. USC, Stanford, and more. So we see some massive academias in here, right? I mean, Harvard, MIT, and Stanford are some of the biggest schools in the world. And then you've got IBM and Microsoft. These are some of the biggest tech companies in the world. And then you've got DARPA and the Federal Reserve, some of pretty much the most core infrastructure parts of the United States. And then you've got things like Pantera Capital, A16C, and Polychain Capital, all big kind of investment and venture capital firms. So Jory definitely has some very interesting connections that he brings to LF0. And speaking of connections, their CEO, Matthew Nyberg, while as we can see here, he doesn't have a ton of work experience, he does have some time at IBM where he actually helped with building the fastest supercomputer in the world. But within one of his research projects, this is his, I actually dug this up in his personal blog, and this is just some of the personal publications he has. Now, when we kind of look through this, we see we see two names brought up a lot, DJ Bates and DB Meta. So I couldn't find much on DJ Bates, but when we look at D Meta, we actually see that this guy has some very interesting experience, and seeing that he's worked with Matthew Nyberg, the CEO for LF0, is really interesting. And, you know, we're not sure if these guys still consistently talk, but these connections are definitely really interesting because this guy spent about 3 years at Vanguard as a senior manager for investment strategies regarding kind of data, AI, and ML. Now, Vanguard is one of the biggest kind of investment companies out there, right? And then up here, we also see head of applied machine learning at BlackRock, which he recently just started last year, a little over a year now. So seeing that Matthew's working with someone kind of that caliber, even though, this guy probably has quite some say in kind of where he's working, being head of applied machine learning, right? As all of finance is kind of blending in with fintech and everything big tech. I'm sure maybe one day we could see some collaborations further between the two of them, while, you know, we might not see BlackRock officially working with LF0. This is quite exciting to see for a project that's kind of still so early in its development phases. That's kind of what we've got for LF0. With AllianceBlock, this is kind of a project building for regulated DeFi, as we've mentioned. So they actually operate in a very interesting way. So instead of just one application like what most DeFi platforms are, so you can think of like Uniswap, which is just a DEX, or Aave, which is a swapping, lending, and borrowing protocol. AllianceBlock actually has tons of different products in here. So they have their Alliance Bridge. This is a chain agnostic bridge that actually utilizes Hedera's consensus services for I guess further consensus and validation across different chains. And so this is pretty much a bridge between different networks for the AllianceBlock platform. And so this further helps with making them agnostic. They have a DeFi terminal, and this is kind of where their liquidity mining as a service for other crypto projects is. So you can think of this as this is a white label service that any project can use to provide more liquidity for their project. And it's actually free to use. All you have to do is list a your token pair with an AllianceBlock. So, you know, this is probably pretty attractive to a lot of early startup projects, and there have been a lot that have utilized this service already. Because, it's free to use. All you've got to do is list your token pair plus AllianceBlock as one of the liquidity pairs. They've got the data tunnel. This is aggregated data from all the oracles in their network. So they, instead of using just one network like many projects do with like Chainlink, for example, they use, I believe, 5 different oracles. Some of them being Chainlink, API 3, Covalent, Parsec, and Icon. There. Those are the 5 oracles they use. So that really ensures kind of the most amount of data feeds coming in. And beyond this, you can share and monetize the data on the AllianceBlock platform, and this is all GDPR compliant. GDPR is pretty much just a standard that is to protect users' data privacy and rights. They also have funders. This is a trustless peer-to-peer lending protocol for small and medium enterprises, which is governed by their AllianceBlock DAO. And so kind of how this works is this needs to be, well, all of these things need to be verified through their trustless KYC and trustless ID verification. And this is in their regulatory compliance layer. And this is kind of what we talked about earlier on, where you have to ensure someone is in the proper jurisdiction before you can really let them have a financial product, to make sure that it's legal in their specific country, right? So funders will kind of allow people to fund small and medium startups in a peer-to-peer manner, because one of the biggest problems with small and medium enterprises at the moment is just a lack of liquidity and funding. And so if you can do this in a peer-to-peer manner where someone kind of sees your startup and they're like, oh, this is cool, I'd love to invest in this. Well, this kind of incentivizes both sides to use the platform further, right? And then they have the Alliance DEX. This also plays into the Alliance Bridge with being a chain agnostic custom automated market maker, which they've actually solved impermanent losses for. So impermanent losses are, I'm not going to explain the full thing here because it is a bit to explain, but it's pretty much an issue with liquidity providing where price fluctuations actually make you lose money. So they've managed to find a way to solve that. It's a lot of math, and you guys can take a look into it in your own time if you want, but essentially this makes it a lot more attractive for institutions and just retail clients to come in and provide liquidity to the AllianceBlock ecosystem, because you don't really have to worry about a loss. Right now, I kind of like to explain AllianceBlock in this way. So we see here, this was actually from my personal MetaMask. You can see all the different kind of DeFi systems I've had to connect to, right? I mean, from Unison to Sushi, ENS, LCX, LTX. This is a massive hassle, and it's kind of also a security risk because you're connecting to so many different platforms, right? AllianceBlock can be defined as simply like a playground, to where think of all these decentralized exchanges, so the swapping platforms like Uniswap, SushiSwap, Trader Joe as monkey bars. And then think of all these different oracles as arcade systems. Then think of these lending and swapping protocols as slides, and then maybe derivative protocols as swing sets. Well, many of these just operate as standalone products, right? Like, for example, if we look at monkey bars as decentralized exchanges, Uniswap is really just a set of monkey bars. Trader Joe is another set of monkey bars, and they're completely siloed. So they're just a standalone playground product, versus AllianceBlock, which is really the full playground itself, and it makes much more sense to do it this way, right? I mean, if you think of this from a playground standpoint, why would you just have a swing set and literally nothing else out there? It makes way more sense to have the complete package of having a swing set that you can access, so the derivative trading platforms, right? But then maybe you, I don't know, make some good trades on the derivative platform, and you want to make some trades through a swapping platform, which you can do so through playing on their monkey bars, essentially, which is where all the different kind of swaps would happen, right, on their DEX. And their DEX is an kind of aggregator with multiple modules. So not only is it agnostic, but you'll be able to connect, different systems and modules in there. So interfaces that you might be more used to personally. Morpheus Network we did talk up on in our most recent tea time. We ran over kind of, their basic operations in being a middleware, and also their connections to the UN ESCAP. The UN ESCAP is focused on kind of the Eastern, Southeast Asian economies, and really just, everything around these sustainable development goals they're kind of building towards, right? So one other thing we did talk about that was really interesting is kind of the work Morpheus Network has had within the UN ESCAP and their talks on trade digitalization. And so when we look up here, we see the ICC on the UN ESCAP's page, and yes, Morpheus Network is right there on cross-border paperless trade database, right? So when we think of cross-border paperless trade, we also think of one specific standard, and this standard is MLETR, Model Law on Electronic Transfer Records. Pretty much what this standard is doing is digitalizing all trade documents, because currently, even in today's era, every trade document has to be inked in pen and paper. This makes it incredibly inefficient because you can't fully execute a trade, like a physical trade, so like a country exporting goods to another country, until you have that paperback signed by both parties in pen and paper. And so that takes days to kind of mail back and forth, and at the kind of scale that countries trade at, it's a ton of paper, right? And it makes sense to kind of digitalize all that. And so one of the risks before was that you could have counterfeit kind of documents, right? Well, with the technologies that blockchain offers, from stuff like NFTs, you really don't have to worry about whether something's been tampered with or whether something's true anymore, because you can verify that all on a blockchain, right? So we talked about that with Morpheus Network. We also talked about Dan Weinberger being a co-chair at INAPA for the supply chain working group, and within the supply chain working group, we also saw him hold a pretty interesting webinar with some INAPA members. These guys actually had experience at LACchain, Standard Chartered Bank, the Interdevelopment Bank, which is of course also connected to LACchain, and we saw Dan Weinberger actually talking up on here for connecting a fragmented world of cross-border payments. So this is pretty interesting, right? And maybe we might see Morpheus Network having some work to do with LACchain in the future. I mean, with LACchain being a DLT kind of alliance to connect all of Latin America and Caribbean, you kind of need a working supply chain there too, right? We also discussed on Morpheus Network collaborating with the Department of Homeland Security, kind of indirectly. So they're doing so through collaborating with a shipping company called Customs Direct, and they kind of sit in between Canada and the US to validate and verify all the kind of imports and exports going in and out between these borders. And so they're working with the Department of Homeland Security for a solution on Canadian borders. And this is pretty massive, right? Whenever you're working with kind of a national kind of national agency, that's really saying a lot for your blockchain project. And I really see projects that are doing so really as kind of the 1% of projects, because I mean, most of these are really just another siloed walled garden. Now, next up we've got Quant. I'm actually not going to go over too much about this because I've realized I've put way too much in here, and this would probably be another hour-long breakdown. But we've talked about their collaborations with SIA, the Digital Pound Foundation, some connections they've had to SDX, so the Swiss Digital Exchange. The Swiss Digital Exchange isn't like any other crypto exchange out there. It's actually created by Six Group. Six Group owns the Swiss Interbank Clearing System, which is this Swiss's real-time gross settlement system. And in addition to that, also the Swiss Stock Exchange. So they're pretty massive. And so they also started up the Swiss Digital Exchange most recently to kind of push forward the adoption of, well, tokenized assets. And one thing we've been seeing a lot is SDX actually mentions QNT strangely often. So that was just one example. If we look up here, this tweet actually got deleted very shortly, but we see that they tweeted, "To become architects of the future, we must first acknowledge that we are playing a fundamentally different competitive game with new rules compared to the ones we played in the past." And then we see $BTC. That's really not saying too much, I guess. Whenever you're talking about digital assets, BTC is probably one of the first few that come to mind for kind of the mainstream side. But then you also $QNT, which is really just, I want to say random. I mean, out of everything, why choose QNT? We also know they're also working with LACchain. We just talked about LACchain regarding Morpheus Network on Dan's conversation with Anapa. LACchain, again, is connecting all of Latin America and the Caribbean together. And so Quant is working with them to help further interconnect those ecosystems while actually also making the Latin American dollar. So this is kind of a new form of currency, right? And this will actually have some form of peg to the dollar in Citibank. So I believe they are planning on making some sort of DLT-based dollar through Citi as well. Citi is one of the participating members within the LACchain Alliance. And then we've heard of their work with SIA, right? So SIA is financial kind of payments railway, and they have over 570 different banks connected to them. Some of these banks being like the Bank of Canada. So that's a pretty large central bank to have, right? And so Quant's kind of working with them to interconnect them all together to a DLT system and have them all connected to Overledger, really. One thing that has been talked about kind of more recently is SIA actually merged with Nexi. Nexi is based in Italy, and they're another payments giant. And so prior to their merger, Nexi was actually working on a digital euro with the European Central Bank. So that's pretty massive, right? We also know Quant Network CEO Gilbert Verdian had spent some time kind of working in the EU Commission for a framework for blockchains, right? Which is a very interesting title because that's very similar to what the bill that recently got finalized, MiCA, Markets in Crypto Assets, is, right? And so there are some hints that, you know, Gilbert might potentially be one of the people that helped with drafting up MiCA, especially when we take a look at it. So here, 3 platforms in Germany have identified and one in Austria. The London Stock Exchange carried out tests are due to be conducted in 2019 to experiment DLT on the secondary market for equities. The Liechtenstein Crypto Asset Exchange, LCX, targets professional investors and plans to provide trading, custody, portfolio management, and analysis services that target all types of crypto assets. The Swiss Digital Exchange will also propose trading, settlement, and custody for security tokens. So this is kind of interesting, right? Because they're mentioning these 3 projects that, well, not projects, but companies that are kind of building in the right way for the forward path of DLT regulatory wise. And they mentioned the London Stock Exchange, which Overledger does actually work with through AllianceBlock. AllianceBlock is partnered with the London Stock Exchange to offer some of their products to the London Stock Exchange's institutional clients, and they plan to connect them doing so through Overledger. They also mentioned LCX, which, as we mentioned, has a partnership with Quant, and as we know, they are quite regulated. And then SDX, the Swiss Digital Exchange. All 3 of these are connected to Quant in some way or form, and seeing Gilbert having a role that's very similar, if not exact, to what MiCA is building is very interesting to see. And then with Constellation Network, we've discussed kind of their operations with the Department of Defense and kind of why and how they went that route. as governments are kind of actually more likely to be the first mover and take kind of more risk on to see if an innovative technology would work, which I thought was kind of ironic because as a government, especially for national critical infrastructure, you'd think they'd be the ones that are very careful, right? We've talked on JADC2 a bit. This is joint all domain command control. And this is kind of what they're working with the Department of Defense. There is also another initiative that they've been building with the Department of Defense for. That's an abbreviation called SPIDER. I can't remember exactly what that one's about, but it's another interesting one to take a look into for sure. They've also co-authored papers with Moby. So Moby is focused on kind of really bringing the idea of autonomous vehicles to life. And so they had co-authored a paper called Connected Mobility Data Marketplace. And while Constellation is no longer a member of Moby, I don't think they should take away from the work that they've previously done. Now, these are kind of some of the projects in their ecosystem. I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen many of these already. So you have different industries like advertising, trading, which Lattice is also a launchpad for the Constellation system now, of course. Healthcare, agriculture, music, gambling, entertainment, gaming, and NFTs. Now, one interesting thing about all these different industries is that these can all be seen as very kind of forward-thinking microprocessing kind of industries. So with advertising, you can see how that could be very microprocessing with all the amount of ads that are out there in the world, right? Trading, that one's fairly self-explanatory. Healthcare, while not so microprocessing, everything with kind of genetic sciences is gonna kind of go towards that kind of microtransaction side of things. And then with agriculture, also very similar to how healthcare has been moving, music, entertainment, and gaming and gambling are all very similar in that sense, to where there's a large transactional volume of kind of a very small microservice that needs to be executed out. And well, the hypergraph is kind of perfect for that, right? Now, finally, we're going to touch up on Energy Web token. So, unfortunately, I didn't have as much time to map out everything from the Energy Web ecosystem, but just to quickly run it down, they run on something called the EWDOS. This is the Energy Web Decentralized Operating System, and at the bottom is the Energy Web Chain. This is really the most important part of the network. Now, as we said, the purpose of Energy Web is so that currently within our current energy grid, everything still runs on legacy energy technology. So you could think things like nuclear power plants. And with all the talks of pollution and ESG, well, we're kind of trying to switch over to these distributed energy resources, right? So distributed energy resources are things like solar panels, wind turbines, electric cars, electric car charging stations. And while we already do have these, they're not quite connected to our current global energy grid infrastructure yet. And so it's hard to kind of connect demanders of energy to suppliers of energy at the moment when everything's kind of siloed off. So Energy Web wants to be the kind of network that holds the infrastructure of this new energy grid in kind of a decentralized way on their network. They've done so through actually, so their beginnings aren't similar to most blockchain networks, where, you know, most blockchain networks have kind of started by an entrepreneur or a developer just being like, I want to develop something. Energy Web actually started as a consortium, and we can see in this consortium, kind of the members in here, a lot of massive energy companies in here, right? And so the way they started was, as a consortium, they wanted to get all these kind of core energy players on board into their method of switching over the energy grid. And so to do this, that's not an easy ask, right? I mean, you've got guys like Shell here, and there's other big companies like PTT, R3, EDF that are all a part of this organization. So
getting these multi-billion and multinational giants to kind of agree and want to help you with pushing this new standard is not a small ask whatsoever. And so they started off with an organization first. Part of this is probably because so companies would take them more seriously. I mean, at the time when Energy Web started, no big company was taking any crypto project really seriously. So starting off as a foundation first, and really then eventually talking about blockchain later on, I think really helped with them, especially in the beginning of onboarding these massive clients. And so these are kind of their larger partners that I've decided to highlight. So with Ally Group and BMW. So Ally Group is a transmission systems operator out in, I believe, Belgium. And so what they do is essentially they transmit energy to other power suppliers so that they can supply that power to, let's say, retail households or other family offices. They're collaborating with BMW and the Energy Web ecosystem to connect all BMW's electric vehicles to Ally Group's kind of transmission systems, so they can ensure things like every electric vehicle is being charged with 100% renewable energy. And then they've also collaborated with Ripple on blockchain decarbonization. So, one problem with blockchains that's being talked about a lot, especially proof of work ones, is that it's too much energy consumption. And well, the way Ripple reaches consensus is actually very energy efficient, but they want to take it a step further and completely decarbonize their blockchain. And we've also seen Algorand take a very similar approach. And so, we may see more similar kind of initiatives like this with other blockchain networks moving forward. With PTT is a multinational kind of energy company that's actually state-owned by Thailand. It's owned by their Ministry of Energy. And so essentially, the Energy Web ecosystem is working with, well, Thailand's Ministry of Energy. So that's, well, pretty big, right? You're working with one of the core infrastructure parts of the Thailand government. And so they're actually building a marketplace for energy attribute certificates under International Renewable Energy Certificates. That's what it stood for. So that's a standard that is heavily being pushed now that pretty much confirms proof of green energy consumption. So these kind of certificates are being sold and traded around the world to sort of be anything from carbon offsets to just proof that your corporation is kind of helping with the whole ESG transition. And so the two of them have kind of built out a marketplace specifically for Southeast Asia to kind of adopt more of this ESG standard, well, IREX standard, because in 2018 there were actually 1.2 billion EACs being traded, so energy attribute certificates, but in Southeast Asia it actually only made up for less than 0.5% of the volume, which is kind of concerning because it's not like those are some super rural countryside areas that don't consume energy, right? A lot of places in Southeast Asia are some of the most densely populated places in the world that consume pretty massive amounts of energy. So seeing more adoption of EAC certificates that are under IREX standards and can be validated by the Energy Web ecosystem is probably going to be a good thing to see for the whole ESG adoption going forward. And then with Sunspec Alliance is a alliance that's focused on kind of the adoption of solar energy. And so they have over 100 different kind of energy-based companies in there. So quite similar to Energy Web, they are also another kind of energy-based consortium, right? So they're kind of working on solar energy-based standards and the installation of solar panels on rooftops in a more kind of consistent environment to where, they'll be installing it on certain jurisdictions or certain companies. that are within the Sunspec Alliance. And then with R3, this is a very interesting one because this isn't like all the other ones we've just talked about that are focused on actually energy, but this is kind of focused on settling payments within the energy industry. So in the energy industry, because it takes time to transmit energy from one place to another, in addition to the silos in the payment system, that's a lot of silos just within two industries, right? So Energy Web's already doing its job to kind of connect the energy grid together, but they can't really be connecting payments together. And so what they've decided to do is they'll actually have payments settle in Energy Web tokens on the back end, so that it's the most kind of pure agnostic form, right? So countries don't have to worry about cross-border payments. So let's say if, I don't know, Germany is operating with the US, they don't have to worry about switching from euros to dollars and the conversion rate of that. They just have to worry about, well, all they know is that the payment's paid for, and, well, they don't need to know that it's settled in EWT on the back end. Where R3 comes in is that this actually just shows up as a bill credit in Oracle's database management systems, which the overwhelming majority of energy companies use nowadays. And so this makes it much more seamless and easy on both the front end and the back end, right? Because on the front end now, all you have to worry about as an energy company is a bill credit that's billed in fiat. That's very traditional and probably something most companies have been used to for decades now. But on the back end, because it settles in EWT, these payments are seamless and executed near instantly versus our current correspondent banking system, where a cross-border transaction could take up to anywhere from 2 to 5 business days. They actually also run on a proof of authority, which things like VeChain also run on proof of authority. What's very interesting, though, is that their network is completely public and permissionless, so any person or device can join their network. And part of the reason for this is because they want to register every single individual device, asset, and company on that comes onto their network with a digital identity, so they can track things like energy usage and kind of the data of, you know, where that energy is coming from and stuff. So they've assigned pretty much everything with a digital identity, whether you're a person, a car, a charging station, a business, etc. So they need to onboard every single client that's going to be using the energy grid onto the energy web chain, right? So that's part of why they have it public and permissionless, because if this was a closed and permission network, they need to validate and verify every single device that comes on. And that's just a massively inefficient hassle, especially during the transition phase when there's going to be probably like tens of billions of different devices, people, and businesses coming onto the energy web chain. And you'd have to validate every single one of those. So it makes more sense to allow everything to join the network, but have these nodes be permissioned. So these nodes are, of course, the companies within the foundation. Now, looking at their team briefly, one thing I did want to mention is that unlike most projects that are, again, founded by an entrepreneur or developer, Energy Web was actually founded by two organizations, that being the Rocky Mountains Institute and Grid Singularity. Now, the Rocky Mountain Institute, this actually has a very, very similar kind of approach to what Energy Web is working to do, which is just pushing the standard of new renewable energies. They've been doing so for about 40 years now, though. So the fact they kind of co-founded Energy Web to kind of expand their vision and really build it on a blockchain just makes sense. And so the Energy Web CEO, Jesse Morris, was actually the previous principal of Rocky Mountain Institute. And so in this organization, again, very similar to Energy Web, they work with everything within the energy sector, from companies that operate in there to stakeholders to policymakers, investors, etc. So during Jesse's time at Rocky Mountain, he definitely picked up some nice experience and connections within the energy industry to, you know, build out the Energy Web ecosystem and migrate some of the members from Rocky Mountains over into Energy Web. Well, not really migrating, but just expanding their operations. And then their senior advisor, Walter Koch, he actually started off as Chief Operating Officer and CEO of Energy Web until Jesse Morris had taken over. So he's had quite an interesting history of experience. He's worked at multiple large telecommunications networks, from things like KPN Telecom, which is the largest telecommunications network in the Netherlands. And it sees some of its largest shareholders as guys like BlackRock and Vanguard, which is saying quite a bit, right? Those are some of the biggest investment companies out there. And then Vodafone, this is another really big one in the UK. And BT. BT is another telecommunications company, and they actually hold a royal warrant. What a royal warrant is pretty much a sign of recognition that's given out to any individual or business that's providing services to Her Majesty's and the royal family's households. Director at ING Bank. This is one of the largest banks in Europe with over $1.1 trillion in assets under management, and they are a top 10 bank in all of Europe. So that's saying a lot. I mean, just think of the connections and how much his network could expand working at a bank as prestigious as ING. And then their head of technology. Again, also probably some pretty interesting connections, but on top of that, a lot of experience within kind of researching and developing blockchains overall. That's kind of what we've got for these 7 projects that we kind of look at, well, on a regular basis. Again, this was just a little, I want to say, review on these 7 projects. I know we've talked about more than 7 in the tea times we've done, but these are kind of the 7 that I wanted to review and go over with you guys as we get further to that capitulation phase, so you guys kind of have an idea of what tokens you guys may want to, you know, accumulate or just research more on. And we have just run over kind of the basic fundamentals of each project. I think for our next tea time, we'll probably have to look further into kind of the tokenomics and what exactly is the token use cases for these specific projects. But that's about all I have for you guys. And if you guys do have questions now, you guys are free to fire away.